We're now going to move from the current state of the world and global security to the future of work and a topic that certainly gets a lot of needed attention, artificial intelligence. We're extremely fortunate to have with us here today Richard Waters, who is going to moderate this panel. Richard is responsible for the West Coast editorial coverage of the Financial Times. He is based in San Francisco, and he leads the news organization's coverage of the IT industry. He's been the Financial Times New York bureau chief and Wall Street correspondent. He covered the intersection of technology, telecom, and media, and was responsible for several other beats as well. He has won awards for his coverage of many things, and I am going to find Richard here somewhere. Richard is right here. Okay, great. So Richard is going to introduce our panelists for the next session. So please join me in welcoming Richard Waters for our next session.
All right. So first of all, I'd like to add my personal thanks to Condi Rice for that last presentation. Not only was it a fantastic tour de force of the state of the world, but I love that message. You know, it's time to hug a Brit, and I think we can all line up behind that, right? You know, let's all hug a Brit today. I'm an American too, but the Brit in me really warmed to that. So the other thing she's done rather conveniently is set up this panel. You know, she said, the robots are the other. Something like that, where she said, actually, we're all picking on the immigrants because we haven't realized it's really the robots, but they aren't an other we can target. Actually, I would say that we in the media have done a pretty good job in the last few years of identifying the robots as the other. And in fact, I think we went way too far. So the robot apocalypse, you know, is a story that dominated the headlines, I guess, starting 2 or 3 years ago, and it was basically, you know, when the robots have done taking all our jobs, then they'll just wipe us out. They won't have any use for us, and that'll be the end of humanity. And you know, I mean, I'm not exaggerating. That was the basis of most of the discussions I had about AI 2-3 years ago, and it seemed rather bizarre. I'm very glad to say that the debate has moved on. That you know, now we're getting to grips with what this technology can really do and what it can't do, how it will really be implemented, what new jobs it might create, and indeed what the real dangers are that you know we need to focus on. And so we've got a great panel here. I think I'm going to come and sit down. Probably the best panel we could get today to run through these. So at the end, Susan Athey of this great august institution, an expert in auction markets and the economics of the internet, also the economics of the news media. I mean, I'd love to solve that problem today, but I suspect we won't. But maybe we'll talk a little bit about fake news. I think I think we're all wondering when fake news gets automated. It seems to be happening. But so Susan, Reid Hoffman, who I think is one of the most forward-looking investors. You know, in these parts, in terms of thinking about the real impact of his investments on social welfare. And you know, this is a field that really needs some creative thinking right now from the Valley. You know, we're in the middle of this kind of tech backlash, and you know, I think it needs some positive, creative thinking about how to implement these technologies and deal with their implications. From the Valley, and I think Reid is thinking about this, you know, more than most people. And then finally, James Manyika of McKinsey Global Institute. You know, amidst all the noise we've heard about automation, I think, you know, James and his team have done more work than most. In fact, most of the good work in terms of actually explaining it and researching it and really digging into what it really means. And James is obviously out there, you know, talking to people who are implementing and helping people implement this. So I think James is, you know, probably the best person right now to help us really understand what's going on. So we'll take some introductory comments from our panelists. We'll have a discussion then and leave plenty of time for your questions at the end. So first of all, I'm going to ask James. James.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Richard, and thank you for being here. What I'm going to do is maybe make some remarks for about 8 or 9 minutes very quickly, and I'm going to use some slides to do that. We're actually at an extraordinary time. I did my PhD in AI and robotics about 20 years ago, and none of us ever imagined we'd be where we are in terms of the progress we've made. And a lot of that work has actually been done even by people here at Stanford. I'm always impressed by the work, for example, that Fei Li has been doing. She leads SAIL, the Stanford Artificial Intelligence Lab. So a lot of the work in these techniques has actually come from places like here, a lot of academic institutions around the world, and also the private sector. And I think I want to dispense very quickly. So, we've seen the examples, everything from driverless trucks. That's actually an actual driverless truck, actually doing a beer run successfully. But also progress we've seen with techniques like in machine learning and artificial intelligence. That's an example of AlphaGo. In fact, the more interesting example from the team at DeepMind, who, Reid and I know them quite well, they're good friends of ours, is actually what they've done most recently with AlphaZero, which actually doesn't learn from human play, but actually creates its own learning techniques and data and teaches itself, and actually does extraordinarily well. So we've seen these breakthrough progress, and much of that actually comes down to a few specific things. One is, yes, the techniques, the algorithms, machine learning, deep learning, reinforcement learning, and all of that have made progress. But we've now put a lot of compute capacity and power against to train these algorithms. So the compute capacity is a big part of the reason we've made progress. The third reason why we've made progress is mostly comes out of the data. We now have extraordinary amounts of data. I remember when I was still doing my PhD, overnight you'd maybe do a few 100,000 training runs with a little bit of data. Now you can do billions of runs in a few minutes with enormous amounts of data. So that's a big part of the reason we've made progress. I think I want to dispense very quickly with a couple of things. This is clearly good for business. The applications, the use cases for businesses are pretty compelling, and businesses will use these techniques. These are also good for the economy. And we're not going to spend a huge amount of time on that, but at a time when we're struggling with productivity, we know that automation is historically and will continue to make big contributions to productivity growth, which we need for economic growth. So the case for the economies, I think, is relatively clear. We think these are also good for society, at least in the sense that these techniques are going to allow us to tackle some big societal moonshots, if you like, problems in healthcare, problems in climate change that are difficult to tackle with any other techniques. So we're not going to spend an enormous amount of time on this, but I encourage you to take this part of it as given. I think the big question is, what about work? And that's where all the conversations end up going. It's a bit like what Secretary Rice was talking about, which is in globalization, we talked a lot about the GDP benefits and all the economic impacts, but forgot about what it meant for workers through the lens which through most people see these things. So what about work? There's been a whole lot of studies by us and by others looking at these questions about the impacts on work. The approach that we've taken, and increasingly many others have taken, the OECD has taken the same approach, is to look at it from a bottoms-up view, to look at tasks and activities. Because what people do, what any of us do, is an amalgamation of different specific tasks. And so you can then ask questions about to what extent are those tasks automatable now with current technologies. So when you take a task-level view, you get an interesting picture. First of all, in the US, the BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and there's various data sets that look at task-level activities. And if you put all the over 3,000 or so tasks that are typically looked at, you can put them into roughly 8 categories. And these are the 8 categories you see on this chart. There are 3 of them where they're very susceptible to automation by the current technologies that we see. And those are the tasks that have to do with collecting data in one form or another, processing data in one form or another, and doing physical work in highly predictable, structured environments. So think of an assembly line or some work of that form. Those 3 categories of activities are very susceptible to automation. And what you see as the percentages there in the top of the blue bars is the degree of susceptibility to automation. You also have another set of tasks that are much harder to automate based on current technologies. But if you just take the ones that are susceptible to automation, what you find is that they make up in the US economy roughly half the activities that people do. And it translates into an enormous amount of wages and work. So then the question becomes, well, what's the density of these tasks and activities in different sectors? Well, we find that there's some sectors where the density of these tasks are very significant. And that's a group at the top, sectors like manufacturing, hence what's happened with manufacturing jobs and so forth, but also transportation and warehousing and retail. whereas you've got other sectors that are, where the density of these tasks is less intensive. You can also take a occupation view. So these numerous dots you see here are actually occupations. So think of an occupation as a welder or an accountant and so forth. And the dots that are higher up the vertical scale represent occupations where the density of the automatable tasks is actually very, very high, whereas the ones at the bottom have the density is relatively low. And you can see this is not a wage-driven thing. There's as much susceptibility in high-wage jobs. The horizontal axis, those are hourly wages on average across the US workforce. So this is not a low-wage or high-wage thing. In fact, it cuts across. It just depends on the types of tasks involved. The other insight that comes from looking at a task-level view is that if you then say, well, how many occupations have the majority of their tasks, call it 90% plus of the tasks that are automatable, we find that it's really only about 10% of occupations. Whereas what we find is that there are many, many more occupations. 60% of occupations have about a third of their tasks that are automatable. So this suggests that, in fact, more occupations are going to change than will be automated away as portions of what people do get automated. So think about what happened with the bank teller, for example. In 1970, before the advent of broad adoption of ATM machines, something like 80% of what a bank teller did was actually counting your money, either to take it from you or to give it back to you. Whereas with ATMs, that occupation changed dramatically. Today, bank tellers spend a tiny proportion of their time doing that. They do other things as portions of the tasks have been automated. So the big question on everybody's mind is, okay, so what's going to be the pace and extent of this automation becomes the real question. Well, it depends on several things. The first is the technical feasibility and what's actually happening with the technologies themselves. How fast are we making progress? Everything that I've showed you so far depends on currently demonstrated technologies, but the pace could accelerate. At the same time, the pace of technological breakthrough could stall. We all forget that there was a long period that often people in the field call the long AI winter, where not very much actually happened until we made progress. So technical progress is a big part of the driver for this. The second consideration is the cost of actually deploying the technologies and adopting them. Think about what happened with the electric vehicle as an analogy. We demonstrated that you could build an electric car more than 50 years ago. When did it actually show up on the streets in a form that people could actually buy and the costs were reasonable? It took a very, very long time in the last decade or so. The third, and this is probably the most important factor, is how this plays into the labor dynamics, both the quality and the quantity of labor, because we know that, and the supply-demand dynamics of that. We know that, for example, if you're trying to automate a task or work where the wages that go with that are very, very, very low. So think about a gardener, for example, where the average wage across the United States is something like $7.80 an hour, versus, say, an accountant, where it's more like in the 30s dollars an hour. The incentives to automate that in the labor market dynamics are such that we're more likely to automate the accountant than we will the gardener, just because of how that plays into the labor market supply-demand dynamics. Then, of course, you have to think about other considerations, including even social acceptance factors. We know that there are some situations where we're more accepting socially of automation in our environments, and we know that some countries, some cultures, some settings are more accepting of these things. So all of this is what plays into. So often when you see the extraordinary estimates of these high rates of automation, a lot of them are actually mostly based on just the first consideration, which is what's now technically possible. And typically when you then take into account these other factors, the numbers and the predictions start to get much more muted and more reasonable and, quite frankly, less scary. But still, the question remains. One of the key questions becomes, okay, will there be enough work for everybody when all this plays itself through? And it's hard to make predictions, partly because of the multiple factors I just described that affect the pace and extent of automation. But we think it's also quite important not to think about just about the jobs or occupations that will decline, but also the growth of jobs in the economy. In fact, our recent research report actually was titled Jobs Lost, Jobs Gained, because there's a part of this where there'll be jobs gained, mostly because of economic growth, demand for work, and so forth. And so when we look at the different scenarios, and this is just a picture of one of them, The left-hand side shows the scenarios, for example, for the US by 2030. And what we find, for example, with very modest and conservative assumptions, that even as occupations decline, which is that roughly 39 number you see, there's going to be enough growth and demand for work to more than make up, in fact, for the jobs lost. And you see, by comparison, a different picture for India, which looks a little bit different, partly because the rates of automation are likely to be less because of what I described earlier, which is the labor market dynamics and the costs and wages associated with labor. So we roughly conclude that unless you take some very extreme scenarios, our conclusion is roughly that, in fact, there should be enough work for everybody as long as we have economic growth and dynamism. Having said that, there's some important, maybe tougher things to deal with. So even if as we have enough work, first we're going to have to deal with the workforce occupation transitions, because we know that some occupations are going to be declining, but we're also going to have others that are going to be growing. So how do we deal with those workforce transition questions become very, very important as the mix of occupation changes. Now, we've gone through that historically in the movement from agriculture, for example, to industrialization and now the service sector. But that transition is a very important one, and we're going to need to think about how we manage the dislocations associated with that. The second important factor is the education and skill requirements. We know that the skills of the jobs that are going to be declining, the ones that are growing, are going to be quite different. In some cases higher, in some cases just different. And so how do we think about the reskilling, the education, the lifelong learning to help workers adapt? That's also why I liked a lot of the comment that Secretary Rice made about investment in human capital is going to become one of the important considerations. I want to point out the third factor we're going to have to face and deal with, which is the wage and income implications, and potentially inequality implications. And this comes from a few particular factors that are worth keeping in mind. One is, if you look at the occupations that are likely to decline and the ones that are likely to grow, today they have very different wage structures. We know that many of the ones that are declining are actually middle wage jobs, actually, that are going to decline, that pay relatively well. And we know that many of the ones that are going to grow, a lot of care work, for example, today don't have great wage structures. We don't pay people in the care occupation categories that well. We don't pay teachers very well. So even as those occupations go up, if the wage structures stay what they are today, we know that it will create wage pressure as one of the reasons we should think about the workforce implications. The other reason we should think about the workforce implications come from the fact that even as we complement people with technology, even if we don't automate the jobs away, we know that when a well-educated person works with a technology alongside them, that actually has a great outcome. The wages probably go up, the productivity go up. That's terrific. But we also have the other end of the spectrum, where when in fact you're complementing a human and the machine is now doing all the hard work, if you like, there's a potential risk that we could be de-skilling that job, even if the job still exists. And when we do that, that may actually put pressure on wages. So even as we think about technology complementing people, we need to think about both ends of those outcomes, the good ones and the potentially challenging ones. So how we think about wage implications is going to be quite important. And then, of course, there's the actual working of the labor markets themselves. And we need to look at some lessons in history here to remind us that we tend to romanticize the Industrial Revolution, but we know that there was a long period now, typically called by economists Engel's pause, where that didn't actually work out so well for quite a while before the wages actually fully caught up and it all worked out well. So we need to think about the workings of the labor markets. So how do we get to a good outcome? Well, there's some obvious things, even if we can't predict the future, there's some obvious things that will make a difference. And here's maybe a list to start with. We know that, for example, when there's demand in the economy and we unlock investment and we actually have economic growth, that actually tends to create jobs. So anything that we can do to reinvigorate economic growth and dynamism will make a big difference. And part of that is reinvigorating business dynamism, because we know that businesses will create jobs, and so entrepreneurship, the kinds of things that people like Reed and others do, are fundamentally important. The third point is probably in some ways, if you take nothing else away from this page, is the one that I'd encourage us to pay attention to, which is the investments in human capital. We know that one of the things that is quite striking is that our economic system, both in the public sector and the private sector, there's very little that's built in to incent investments in human capital. We've created all kinds of incentives for the private sector to invest in R&D, to invest in capital, and so forth, and we created all kinds of mechanisms to depreciate that and all kinds of things. We do very little when it comes to investments in human capital. We also know that both the public and the private sector spending on-the-job training by both the public sector and the private sector has actually been declining in the United States for the last 30 years. And in fact, the US actually spends the least out of all the OECD countries in terms of investments by both the public and the private sector in on-the-job training. So we would have to reverse those kinds of things to make the kind of human capital investments we're talking about that are important. And it's hard to avoid the income-wage question, especially at a time when we have vast amounts of inequality. These technologies could make this even worse. So this question of how do we think about incomes and wages, I happen not to be a particular fan of universal basic income, but I think it prompts the right question, which is that we need to tackle the question of incomes and wages. I think there are other ways to solve for that question, but it's an important conversation. And then finally, we know that there's a vast range of investments, infrastructure being one of them, et cetera, that we know will be good for all kinds of other reasons, but also for jobs and wages and work. So the more we can think about how do we make those kinds of investments, this actually helps all this end up in a good place. So while it's hard to make predictions, it seems like some list like this represents the kinds of things we should be thinking about that helps us get this to a good outcome. Richard?
Thank you, James. Well, I think James has solved the problems for us. Thank you, James. So, Susan Athey.
So I came to this problem of artificial intelligence about 11 years ago when I took a little bit of time off of academics and I went to help run the search engine at Bing. It wasn't called Bing then, at Microsoft. And I realized I came in to sort of think about the economics of the industry and how to compete with Google, but it became very clear very quickly that you couldn't think about the industry competition without getting pretty deep into the machine learning and AI that were operating the search engine. And after that, I've brought that back now into my academic research. And so one of the things I thought would be useful to start with in this conversation is just to sort of level set on where AI and machine learning are particularly effective and useful, and where they ran into problems even at one of the biggest and most sophisticated sort of machine learning driven operations, because I think it helps us predict where the impact will be felt and kind of a little bit of the why behind which jobs will be affected. I sit on panels even with AI experts who say things like, we'll be able to automate a central banker. In fact, even on a panel with a central banker, an AI expert thought that they would say, I can automate your job, or I can really change, put a robot in a place of a middle manager. And so to understand why those claims don't make a lot of sense, I think it's useful to really see what the technologies do. So one of the biggest advances recently has been in neural nets. And they sound really smart, and they are really amazing, but they do something actually very simple. So when you go to a machine learning or AI conference, academic conference on the cutting edge, you see a lot of presentations with pictures of cats and dogs. And that's because really one of the main tasks that we've been training and improving neural nets on is classifying images. So you take all the pixels in a picture, and then there's a label. It's a cat or a dog. And then you get a very large data set with lots of sets of pixels, and then labels, cats or dogs, and you figure out patterns that help you. If you got a new set of pixels, you could say whether it was a cat or a dog. Now, this is a very simple task, we've gotten really, really much better at it. Accuracy rates have gone way up as a result of innovations in algorithms as well as innovation in computing. But one thing about it is that it's something that works well in a stable environment. Like the patterns that you find in the algorithms have to be stable. You don't actually, one of the things that makes it a general purpose technology is you don't have to tell it anything about anatomy or biology or physics or anything. You just put in the pixels and you give it the labels and out comes the answer. So it's general purpose because you can do this with knowing almost nothing. You can apply this to lots and lots of simple settings. But the exact reason that makes it so applicable and easy to apply also gives it great limitations. If you're not telling it about anatomy, it doesn't know which which aspects of these pictures are stable or would apply in different environments. If today, all of the pictures that have pianos also have cats, because it's easier for cats to play the piano than dogs. If tomorrow I teach my dog to play the piano and the internet gets filled with piano-playing dogs, the algorithms will be confused because they thought those black and white rectangles were associated with cats. And so they're not smart in the way of really understanding why they do what they do. So if you think about another example would be credit scoring. So if I might have lots of examples in Africa of taking mobile phone data and trying to make loans to people. That's a new application of machine learning. All I know about the person is where their phone has been and what it's done, and I'm going to make a loan for them. If I make a 2-week loan, then I can pretty quickly generate a lot of examples, and I can see whether my machine learning algorithm is working or not. And I can incrementally improve it just by tweaking aspects of the algorithm until it gets better. And that incremental improvement is actually the innovation engine of Silicon Valley, really. Google and Facebook, they just make lots and lots and lots of incremental improvements, and they see how things are working, and they improve. That's the beauty application of machine learning and AI, where you can just keep getting better and better. But if I want to make 5-year loans or 10-year loans, I'm not going to really know how I'm doing for quite a long time. And so if I make a black box algorithm to make a 10-year loan, I might figure out only in year 8 that people are defaulting or repaying based on mistakes in my algorithm. And so this is a very bad application of unstructured machine learning that doesn't tell you anything about the environment or where you're not really crafting the model. In the old world, we would use sort of simple models, very simple models, and a small number of data points. So the human had to put a lot more structure on it. Now they're very unstructured, but they're also much less good at extrapolation. They also aren't good at asking questions about what would happen if I changed something? What would happen if I changed prices? What would happen if I introduced a new product? Those are not good tasks for the part of machine learning and AI that has seen very recent innovation. So that's actually part of my research agenda, and a group of us at Stanford are trying to figure out the best ways to combine those recent innovations into more old-fashioned models that have a little more structure on them. But broadly, that's not where the innovation was. The innovation was in finding patterns. And so places where these work very well are things where there's lots of data about a person or a unit, and it's hard, and you have to make decisions quickly, and it would be hard for a human to do so. So even reading lots of resumes to figure out who to interview, who should get out on bail, where should I allocate an inspector, when should I send social services to a home if based on some report of potential child abuse. Those types of settings are settings where there's lots of information, but people just don't have time to incorporate it all and use it. On the other hand, making more complex business decisions is not automatable in that way. You don't have an easy reward, and you can't try lots of experiments to learn quickly what happens. So I think from that perspective, this idea of the AI overlords is just not interesting, really. And what is interesting is the fact that it's going to automate a lot of tasks, in which will have different implications on the labor market. So I think we've talked a lot, and we will talk more about how those impact the labor markets. I want to spend a couple minutes talking about product markets. So inequality, part of that is how much you earn, but the other half of it is what you can buy with what you earn. And so if labor is getting substituted for robots that make goods with low marginal cost, like you build a big robot, but then the marginal cost of the goods goes down, that actually, in principle, leads to lower prices. That's why a lot of economists, especially kind of macroeconomists or economists who tend to view the world through perfect competition, just think this is a non-issue. I have colleagues who tell me I'm like wasting my time to worry about the problems of automation. Because of course, if you can make more with less, everybody's got to be better off. Like if we all have shares in the factory and the factory makes one good and we all eat it, we certainly would like a more efficient factory. So the problems come because we have more complicated markets. And just because something's cheaper to make, it's not necessarily cheaper to eat. And further, we don't all own shares in that one big factory. So let's talk about the competition side. We've seen, of course, amazing welfare benefits from the tech firms. I get a couple of boxes from Amazon every week. They're delivered to my door. My kids get annoyed if it's not coming the same day, and they have to wait until tomorrow to get their item. So obviously, all of the automation and AI that Amazon is using to reduce cost is also translating into lower prices and increased assortment for all of us. But that's also, Amazon in the end is still operating in a very competitive environment. They're still small as a share of all retail. Consumers have other options of where to buy, and so a lot of that innovation is getting passed on to us. On the other hand, we generally have seen a fair bit of concentration in the tech industry. There's a dominant search engine, and so on. And I don't think we necessarily can expect that every one of these innovations is going to translate into lower prices. One place I think this has special importance is in autonomous vehicles. So if you think about autonomous vehicles, are we going to have concentration in autonomous vehicles, or are we going to have competing firms? And how is that going to work? How is the policy going to translate that innovation into welfare for people? So a few points. First of all, we'll think about things like what information has to be shared. Will all the autonomous vehicle companies need to share information about pictures of roads that they take when they're out on the roads? That might make it easier for others to enter. On the other hand, that could reduce the incentive for the companies to collect all that information to start with. So we're going to have tough questions about what information needs to be shared. Of course, I don't think we'll have a global monopoly because countries won't really accept the idea that one Silicon Valley firm, they might accept them serving their searches, but they're not going to accept them also operating their entire transportation infrastructure. So I do think globally we will have multiple autonomous vehicle firms. And then the second question is, how will we regulate them, and will we regulate them in a way that is beneficial for solving inequality problems? So right now there's 1 million jobs in Silicon Valley, not literally 1 million, there are lots of jobs in Silicon Valley at high wages. Just try to hire any kind of service provider, from a housekeeper to a landscaper, so on. It's very hard to hire people here because we don't have enough housing. If we can use innovations in transportation policy to make it possible to live at what's now 2 hours away and provide services in the cities, that could actually do a lot for inequality. So you could think about somebody living somewhere where there's actually lots of land, so housing is cheap. It's cheap to produce goods. It's cheap to get goods delivered to them, so the cost of their goods fall. They can potentially commute at a lower cost to jobs in a city. For that matter, education and healthcare can also be impacted by automation, making those things cheaper. That's one path to sort of having all these benefits be shared. But if we continue to think about the not in my backyard, bad housing policy, bad transportation policy, and allow for concentration and a lot of the benefits of automation going to a few individuals and not getting passed on to consumers and prices, we could have a very different outcome. So I think there's really actually, the positive is I think there's a lot we can do about it, but we need to start doing the research and thinking about the policy that leads us down the good paths and not the bad ones. And that's certainly things we're thinking a lot about in our research here at Stanford. Thanks.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you for demystifying that. And I think a lot does come down to the language, that the language of this artificial intelligence and neural networks creates this impression of a technology that's far ahead of where it actually is. So thank you for that. Reid.
So a lot of what James and Susan have said, I strongly agree with. I'm going to make a few comments. I'll try to get us to our discussion sooner, because I think that'll be interesting for all of us. The natural deployment of artificial intelligence, if you kind of take a different lens than what James was saying, is to where there are large costs and lots of expense. And so that usually tends to be a major amount of labor expense. And that tends to either be where there's lots of people or they're very high priced. And then the intersection of the two of them is, well, okay, what's the cross product, number of people times wages, and then susceptibility of the task automation tends to be where the natural economic incentives to develop and deploy this technology is. And that's actually the natural function in economics of progress and productivity. So the question that we have is how are kind of jobs going to be created? Because people worry that the robots are coming for our jobs. The actual term that Richard didn't go that was bandied around a couple of years ago is robocalypse. To put the two together, I myself have been something of a public voice trying to say don't use that term. So there, I just failed my own test. But I think the key thing is to think about that technology can be directed. What frequently happens is that people say, okay, like, oh gosh, all this technology stuff is happening. Let's regulate it, slow down, stop, get a chance to think about it. You can call these people slow downers. And the problem is, of course, we live in a global world where nations, societies, companies are all competing with each other. And technology essentially shapes the drumbeat of kind of where we are going to be going, where our power of nations is, which values are going to be embodied in the technology, whether that's economic power, whether that's military power, whether that's political power. And so you, generally speaking, don't want to kind of say, okay, let's slow down, because other people are not necessarily slowing down. You want to say, how do we get to the right outcome sooner? Like, how do we actually hit the accelerator, but shape it and go in the right directions? And one of the things that people too often forget is that technology is one of the most dynamic things. It's like what we create, what we direct, what we innovate to in terms of kind of how it plays. And so what I wanted to do is talk a little bit about kind of how jobs will be created, and then some of the ways that technology can actually help that, and then a little bit about kind of some kind of shining a light on some places we should look in order to help with that. Now, one of the most central things that I think is that jobs will be created essentially through entrepreneurship. I think that the notion when you say, well, we have massive changes in kind of the task structures, such as that James was talking about, or kind of labor forces, or which products, like for example, we have the natural forces, we have less people assembling more of this kind of good, well, then we have more productivity and we have potentially more economics in terms of how this plays, but then we need to have new products and services. We need to have the creation of new kinds of entrepreneurship. The worry that people have about this is, well, maybe with AI, this time is different. Because while we can look at the change from the agricultural to the industrial age and say, well, okay, it did create a huge amount of new productivity, maybe the speed at which kind of the tasks are being automated, the new things are happening that people just can't adjust, and that you're getting to self-learning robots, a little bit like what James was talking about AlphaZero. Because by the way, AlphaZero will beat AlphaGo in a Go competition, and so what do you do about that? And that's I am generally speaking optimistic that we can solve that problem in terms of entrepreneurship and new jobs, but I think it's one of the things we have to focus on. And as James said, the transition is particularly key. I think another thing that's central to focus on is that one of the steam valves is the peer-to-peer jobs. So it ranges anything from caretaking and the aging society, as James was talking about, education. The natural economics of education is how do we have larger classrooms? Well, we can go to smaller classrooms, entertainment, live events. As James mentioned, the wages are a particular issue here, because obviously you have to, if the wages are not quality wages, then you still have the social problem. And I think the good news is this is solid for transitions. The challenges are the shift, this kind of services economy actually, in fact, has certain slowness in growth, because you're precisely saying, well, we're moving to less leverage than more leverage in this, and part of what happens with economics is leverage. So I think it's a good thing, but not necessarily the kind of the end solution. One of the things that James also emphasized was reskilling. And I think it's a certain necessity that we're going to need to do this reskilling, that we're going to need to change from an educational paradigm from more of the industrial paradigm where we said, well, we sent you to college, or high school, and we prepared you, and now you go off to the workforce, and you've been trained, and now you have your life at work. I actually think you're going to need to have a continuous reskilling as something that's going to need to happen, everything from the educational institutions to the corporate. The challenge, of course, is this is scary for people. There's a wide swath of people to whom this is not their natural paradigm. Obviously, the people in this room at amazing Center of Higher Education and Research are all like, oh, we know about reskilling. We learn all the time. For a lot of people, this is kind of scary. And so how do you navigate that is challenging. And so what I think is interesting is to say, how do we actually, in fact, say, rather than saying, well, okay, this automation and AI and everything else is really scary, how do we say, well, we should actually, in fact, start trying to make sure that we're developing technologies that have the output of more of these kind of quality middle-class jobs, more of the kind of opportunity for your average citizen. And that's part of what, as per what Condi was emphasizing, is the people who go, well, okay, the others, she's absolutely right. They don't tend to go, the robot took my job, or the robot's driving my truck now. They tend to say, oh, the Mexicans took my job, even though they're a huge trade partner of us, and we should do something like build a wall, which is absolutely insane, in my point of view, in a variety of ways. And so you say, well, the key thing of that is how do you give them paths to having meaningful, productive lives and good jobs? And so you want to start essentially incenting technology to do this. And one of the key things, of course, as both James and Susan were talking about, is it has to be quality jobs. It can't just be the more that's driving down, like the gardener and the accountant, the more that's driving down to the low wages, that still does not achieve what we want as a society. So here's some of the things I think are useful to think about. So think about like technology for entrepreneurship. And the natural thing would be to say, well, do you have an AI that's assisting the entrepreneur and so forth? And I think, well, maybe at some point, but don't really know how that would work. But like take some of the interesting work networks that are being created. Airbnb, right? It's like when people say, look, I'd like to supplement my own income. I have a house in a suburbia. Like one of the pieces of advice I would give them is, well, do you have a big enough backyard that you can build an interesting treehouse? Because on Airbnb, which maybe some people in this room know, the wait lists for the tree houses that are interesting is about 9 months for being able to book them, right? Because it's a new and interesting, unique experience. It's basically turning everyone into a possible micro-entrepreneur if this is one of the ways that they're looking for income. Another thing that Airbnb is doing is this thing called magical trips, which is how do you enable people to be entrepreneurs to turn any location into a potential tourist destination. And so, like think about Detroit and you say, well, okay, how would Detroit be a tourist destination? You say, well, actually, in fact, there's a thriving art communities. There's a bunch of stuff going on in urban agriculture. There's actually a bunch of stuff going on in terms of various different foods, like breweries and everything else. You say, we're going to organize a tour of that, right? We're gonna give you the kind of the new hip artist, and maybe you can actually go and work in their studio for an hour or two and so forth. And by people being entrepreneurial here, it actually can then create even some place that you would never think of as an interesting tourist destination as a tourist destination. And this is kind of a way that you say, well, you can use networks to enable people to be to have interesting economic generation. And these allow them to be entrepreneurial and allow them to create additional economics. Another thing that recently I learned, because for the podcast that I'm doing called Masters of Scale, and this interview is not live yet, I interviewed the CEO of TaskRabbit, Stacy Brown-Philpott. And one of the things that their community is doing that's really clever, it's another use of networks to try to produce economics, is they have this kind of demand of certain kinds of tasks coming into TaskRabbit. And then what happens is they go, okay, well, the electrical jobs are actually paid more, right, than the go get a burrito job. But the people who learn those electrical skills or have those electrical skills can also make some money by teaching other people in the network the electrical skills so they can start doing their jobs. So that gives you a dynamically adaptive system, and people are naturally will be searching for what are the things that give them better economic systems. And I thought that was a particularly clever way of using the kind of the cloud of humans to be adaptive to kind of what are the new tasks or the new demands that are coming from the market. And obviously one of the things that I myself have been deeply involved in here is LinkedIn, because the principal thing on LinkedIn is to say, okay, what are the trends and jobs and skills of the future? How do I know them? How do I learn them? And so one of the things we talk about at LinkedIn is this thing called an economic graph, which is put in digital representation all the things that really matter to kind of an economic future for individuals, companies, regions, countries, et cetera, and then allow intelligent navigation through all that information, whether or not you're an individual, like, okay, where should I look for work? What kinds of jobs? Which jobs are available to me? Which skills do I need to get? How do I get the best possible edge in order to get into those jobs? Companies looking for talent, cities. We have this project called LinkedIn Cities saying, okay, well, which are the industries that are really growing in the future and which should I be helping with that and how should I be directing policy on that? And this all leads to everything from the entrepreneurship of the individual in their own career. So the first book I wrote was called The Startup Review, which is every individual is going to need to be entrepreneurial, even if they're not starting a company, entrepreneurial and essentially how they learn skills. And all the way to the formation of new businesses. So I think there's a stack of things where you could look at how, kind of these kinds of technologies can be incented to say, let's figure out how do we say make people more productive, and whether or not those are taxes for corporations, whether or not those are incentive and capital programs. I think there's a number of things that you can do on the incentive program that I think is useful. There's one of the things that I think is most central is we tend to, in economics arenas, say, well, the principal incentive is how do you shape kind of like the taxes or the capital or everything else. There's a lot of other incentives that we should do and we should start deploying. So for example, Susan was talking about we need to be looking at these policies and we need to be figuring out what are the policies that would shape this and what are the policies that would incent technologies that would be creating jobs. Well, some of it is like, let's start doing prizes for ideas, right? Like, let's start like saying, okay, we want to start having direct kind of essay competitions for this. That would be something that a government program or universities could do, and making sure that we are looking for what are the set of ideas that we have. Because one of the things that I would add to James's list, which he knows, but just in terms of adding in the stuff to think about, is we're also in this accelerating dynamism with technology. So there isn't really this end state. It's one of the problems. People say, oh, the robots are all going to take our jobs. It's not going to happen that way. But each decade is going to be different. And so we need to be continuously adaptable. And so our solutions have to be adaptive, which means that we have to use technology as part of the solution. So I'll close by considering kind of the autonomous vehicles for these comments, the autonomous vehicles. So it's clear that autonomous vehicles over a 20-ish year time frame, maybe even a 10-year time frame, will start making a significant impact in driving jobs, which there's a lot of driving jobs. And so, the natural question is, should we try to slow this down? Well, I wrote an essay on LinkedIn a few years ago saying we should try to accelerate toward a completely autonomous future. It's 90% plus reduction in fatalities and injuries. It's 4 to 8 times throughput on the current infrastructure. But the key question is how do we figure out creating the new jobs? Now, one of the things I think is interesting when you say, okay, AV is going to transform like space, because no longer do you need to live as close as possible and drive the economics of like, rentals in San Francisco, Peninsula, up as much, because AV transforms that space. It also means that we can have interesting economic productivity, just like cars enabled suburbs decades ago, right? The question of saying, okay, well, we can now even create like construction booms, centers of entertainment, other kinds of things in a broader space. And then, as one of the things that Susan was emphasizing, a bunch of these things, the quality of life is not just the rising wages, which matters, but also cost of living. So if cost of housing comes down, if the cost of transport comes down, if the cost of, ultimately what we should direct us is the cost of medicine comes down, then even moderate sense of progress and kind of, okay, I'm doing better and my kids have a chance to do better, can still lead to fairly quality lives. And so the thing I would like to close with is to make sure that we understand that the that technology needs to be the solution and not the problem. We need to shape it. We can't say stop that tech because there's natural economic reasons for creating it. We need to create additional tech that has the right kinds of society and community implications that we want. And I do think that it's possible to encourage entrepreneurship. People frequently say, well, economists say free markets, open markets, entrepreneurship takes care of itself. I've actually found that there's lots of reasons why entrepreneurship tends to be calcified against, even in the US. There's everything from regulatory capture, where large companies say, well, here's the regulations. That means small firms have difficulties entering. That's actually one of the reasons why I'm in strong favor of net neutrality, because the net neutrality allows new entrants much more easily, and that enabling of entrepreneurship is important. But also even things like an investment that I made in London called Entrepreneurs First, which basically says, how do we get more companies going in these environments that are not quite as entrepreneurial as we are here in Silicon Valley, and how do we form that, and how do we get those more efforts going? Those are the kinds of things I think all areas of the world work. And like Endeavor, which is a global entrepreneurship network, used to be mostly working in like South America, Turkey, Jordan, et cetera, to try to form entrepreneurship communities there, has now also come back to the US, working in Miami, working in Detroit. And those things I think are very good for our future indeed. And so with that, I think we'll shift to the panel.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. So we've covered a lot of ground. I really want to give you a chance to ask some questions before we break. I'll just hit a couple of the high points here and ask you to be fairly succinct in your responses so that we do get to you. I guess the first thing, Susan, you pointed out the limitations of this technology. James, you talked about how rapid automation has happened before. But nonetheless, there is a fear that this time is different. And even if it's not in the 3 to 5 year time frame, at some point out there, this technology will get to a stage that really it will have this far more disruptive impact. And so, driverless cars is the kind of obvious case I think we all think about, where autonomous technology will really only be advanced driver assistance for many years, but eventually we'll get to level 5, and then 3 million truck drivers' jobs goes, or whatever it is. So, is there a case for thinking this time really is different?
Well, two things seem different this time. So if you look at historically, we were mostly automating physical tasks, adding power, and so forth, and speed and so forth. This time it looks like we're tackling sort of cognitive tasks, and cognitive tasks that involve kind of tacit knowledge. So that feels a little bit different. But what doesn't look any different at all is the pace of adoption. So if you look at the pace of adoption, that doesn't seem to be any different at all. So I think when we think about this question of is this time different, the types of tasks are maybe a little bit different, but how it will play out in the labor market doesn't look like it's vastly different.
Everybody seems to, we all like to think that we're the exception. Our jobs won't get affected by this. But when you think about cognitive tasks, let me invite you to kind of address this. How much of your jobs are exposed here, and how much of the people in this room should worry? What about you, Reed?
So a little bit, we're definitely seeing much more automation of what was generally considered to be very high-end tasks. The classic one that's used in discussions like this is radiology, because the image recognition technologies that Susan talked about applied to radiology mean that if you were picking a trained AI or your average radiologist right now, you'd rather have the trained AI do that. Now that doesn't put the radiologists out of business, right? So they still okay, what is this weird corner cases, or cross-checking this, or making sure that when the machine's improving, it's improving in the right direction. Also talking to patients, right? Because the machines are not yet good at doing that. Although, by the way, even that there is some debate within the field on, because there's certain ways, a little bit like ATMs, where some groups of people feel much more comfortable talking to a machine in certain ways than they do feel like talking to people. It's easier in some ways. And so there's some experimentations about creation of faces and facial images and video and so forth, and having AI-backed kind of conversational engines. Now, I do think that a little bit, as Susan was saying, the immediate stuff tends to be tasks which aren't long-term tasks, but like things that you would do by making kind of decisions under a few seconds, right? That's part of an AV. Do I change lanes? Do I hit the brakes? Does this look like cancer or not? And so forth. So I think that the investing job I do is some ways off from maybe AI assisted, but some ways off. But we are working on news content creation. So maybe we're coming for you in some way.
So I agree with everything that Reed said about that. And I guess when I look at my job, one of the things that I do is use data to help make decisions. I think historically we would have a research assistant run a lot of different versions of models. We would spend a lot of time looking at the results and thinking about them. And so machine learning applied to data there is basically letting a robotic research assistant run 1 billion models. And for the parts of my statistical task that were just prediction, I just needed to kind of fit the data, they do it much better than my research assistant, which actually also helps science have more integrity because you can tell people how you arrived at your model specification. So it's an algorithm choosing my statistical model instead of me as the art of it. On the other hand, aspects of statistics still remain an art, like deciding whether you can really learn what you want to learn from the data set that you have. And the aspects that involve extrapolation or what-if parts of the problem are parts that still require a lot of human judgment. And so I think more broadly, both in science and in industry, these jobs of like managing the algorithms and also thinking about what's outside the algorithm. So what happens when the algorithms interact? What happens if sellers on a platform are all using algorithms to set prices? Or I think that those types of considerations are kind of more the cutting edge, but where you ultimately need a human to decide and think about what the broader context is, or things like discrimination and fairness and so on.
The other thing that Susan said that reminded me it's important is the current algorithms, the neural nets, the deep learning, require lots of data. So if you don't have lots of data that you can train against, then that's currently not susceptible. It's the way that James was describing.
Susan, I think Twitter's already descended into a war of the bots. We can already see it out there, and it's coming. I want to move on to something you said, Susan, and maybe get beyond the question of work here, which is how the benefits of AI are going to be shared equitably, and how it's going to improve the well-being of most people. And you ended by saying, this is an area you're researching, that it's but I guess it's the political climate I'm most concerned about. Is this debate, we're talking about it, but is it being held publicly? The robots, as Condi Rice said, are not really the focus of public attention. How does this become an issue that we can address? And how do we make sure it benefits everybody?
So I think that this has been a theme in a number of people's comments this morning that I strongly believe in, that AI can really be part of the solution. We have figured out how to use, get people to get addicted to games and keep trying and trying and trying to get to the next level. We've figured out how to make the user experiences great and engaging and keep people involved for commercial applications. It's a fairly short step to take that over and use that for training and coaching and helping people with things that are difficult for them to make them more productive. I think that if you think about the area of home health aides for the elderly, parts of that are the people are worried about making mistakes, you're worried about errors, you're worried about memory issues. All of that can be assisted with automation, and so you can create really meaningful jobs. So sort of connecting back to the universal basic income point, I'm also not a fan because I feel like of course we have enough jobs. Like anybody who's taking care of an aging parent or a 2-year-old knows that we basically need like one person per one recipient, and so there's enough jobs. We need to make it possible for people to do those jobs effectively without making mistakes, without abusing the children, without abusing the elders, but that's all solvable with technology that we have today. In which point you can actually create meaningful work for a large set of people in a way that helps people's own retirement not get ruined by spending the entire time caring for their sick spouse and then dying themselves. So I think that there's really a lot of beneficial work that can be done, and technology can enable it in a way that also makes sure there's jobs for everyone.
James.
Yeah, no, I was going to add, I think to Susan's point, I think the question is really how our labor markets work. Because I'm actually less worried about the benefits to consumers and users of these technologies. I think those will typically happen. I mean, it's the same thing that happened with globalization. We've got lots of product choice and so forth. The question is what happens to the labor markets. And we've already had this challenge right? We've had wage stagnation for the last 15 years, if not more, depending on how you measure it, and incomes haven't grown. And how that plays into the political economy becomes the real question. In fact, one of the things that sociologists always remind us is that, in fact, in the political economy, people's preferences reflect their views as workers, much less their views as consumers. In fact, the historical fact is that in the US system, the only time people voted as consumers was in the oil crisis. Otherwise, the rest of the time, it's much more predictive to understand all these questions through the lens of workers and incomes and wages and stagnation. So I think we have to grapple with how the labor markets work. We can all talk as much about unpaid care work and work in the home, about teachers and home health care. We've never had a market labor structure that works very well for those kinds of occupations. And those are the hardest things to automate. So as those kinds of jobs become more predominant, how are we going to make our labor markets work better, I think, is a fundamental question.
So just to pick up on that, I mean, I think one of the issues is that some of those things have been government provided, so that's where the redistribution comes in. The political climate right now around redistribution and really investment in effective government intervention is not great. We don't have effective training programs. Condi mentioned the block grants to states, which I like in some ways, but on the other hand, if we wanted to have a lot of R&D that went into a really good AI-driven solution, actually that needs scale, and some of those things can't be done with tiny grants. They need to be actually bigger R&D efforts. So I think figuring out, I think we all have the capability to make these things happen, but don't think it's at all a done deal that we will figure them out, because they require a bunch of things that are pretty hard for us to do politically. Yeah.
Well, last question for me before I open this one up. Reid, I guess when we think about this kind of hollowing out of the middle, the loss of all these kind of well-paid middle jobs, we all believe that we need a dynamic economy, and our entrepreneurialism will play an important part in that. When you talk about micro-entrepreneurs, we all think about Uber drivers, right? We think about people who net are earning $3 an hour, whatever it is. And as you say, people are scared. This is a very scary future. When jobs go, work remains, but it's not jobs. It's a very scary kind of position. So how do we, well, first of all, what chance are there that these micro-entrepreneurs are actually going to make a decent living at scale? And what kind of jobs are they going to be?
So that was one of the reasons I used Airbnb, TaskRabbit, LinkedIn as examples, not Uber. Yeah, not to say that Uber couldn't get there, because if what you're trying to do is treat your human cloud as a cost that you're trying to reduce and commodify, that will be a problem versus a solution. But one of the things I wanted to highlight is there's a number of these networks that actually, in fact, trying to figure out how to raise your wages, right? How to have you make more money. You could also go Etsy, you can also go eBay. There's a variety of these things that you can say, here is ways that they want you to make more money. They're incented for it. They get a percentage of the sale price. It's like, if you can sell for more, that's better, right, as a way of doing it. And then the loop works well. And so there's a variety of those things, and those are the things I think we should really try to emphasize. Now, say, for example, you said, well, look, maybe the micro-entrepreneurs of magical trips won't really work out in the kind of scale we want. Well, this is also one of the places where you can begin to direct intelligent incentives, because you could say, well, all right, what we want to do is we want to keep people productive and engaged because it's better for society, but we need to support wages. So say, for example, we said, look, this kind of, like any platform is doing something like magical trips. We could say, well, okay, if for the first $10,000 you make on this, we'll match you dollar for dollar publicly, right? So we'll say, okay, go do this, provide a service to other people, be engaged in society, be a worker, and we'll make sure that your wages in this dynamic system, right, because the dynamic system is much more adaptive than a centralized one is the way to do that. It would be an instance of a thought.
All right. I mean, we skirted around the redistribution question, but it's obviously going to be central here in some ways. Right, well, let's open this up to some questions, and maybe we can eat into a couple of minutes of the break as well. There's one in the middle here, and then we'll take one behind. And if we can keep both the
follow up
questions
on
and
a-
answers tight, thank you.
To follow about a remark that Reed made, I had a question for James on your remark on entrepreneurship. You had a whole list of things, one of your slides, that need to be done. Of those things, which would be best to leave to free enterprise and entrepreneurship? Which would be better to be stimulated by the government, and which do you think should be done by the government?
Well, I think there's one item that should be done by both the private sector and the government, and that is the investment in human capital. Because we know that, again, I guess public expenditure on that has been declining. We also know that private sector expenditure on that, on the job training, has been declining. So that's a joint activity by everybody. I think that the last point that I had about investments that are both good for jobs and for the economy, that's probably the job for government. So investments in infrastructure. We know that if there was a big infrastructure activity in the country, that would actually help stimulate jobs and labor markets, and that's probably best done by the government. I think that when it comes to business dynamism, clearly that's a job for the private sector, but I think the government policy can create the right environment for that to be the case, where businesses thrive and there's a lot more business dynamism. So that's an example where the government can set the right conditions, but the work for business dynamism and opportunity and creation and entrepreneurship is done by the private sector.
I did see a question. If you put your hand up right in. Yeah. And then if anybody else has any questions, there's one right at the back.
Hi, Mark Wolfson. As I sort of reflect on the last two sessions together, first of all, it was a terrific panel. Thank you very much. Extraordinary thoughtfulness in your comments. But as I think of integrating some of the remarks that Condi was making, I'm reminded of a couple of things that may have been missing from the conversation. So first of all, we need to recognize that not all users of AI technology have the welfare of consumers in mind. And in particular, we have rogue states with lots of individuals who have access to technology that can do some we can imagine doing some pretty terrible things with AI. So among the regulatory considerations we must bear in mind is how to address security issues, nefarious intent, and the like. And then the second thing I think I'm reminded of from Condi's remarks is that as we think about how to regulate, and Susan began to address some of the challenges associated with regulatory policy, it's a very difficult thing. But there's a big difference between a closed economic system and an open economic system. So, Reed, you had some terrific observations about how you can attempt to incentivize certain forms of entrepreneurship, which might represent an element of sacrifice to the efficiency of the deployment of AI technology. But when you're competing against an army of Chinese artificial intelligence scientists who may not make those trade-offs in the same way, and there's competition between whose AI technology gets to improve efficiency for global consumers, the challenge is to implement a regulatory policy get multiplied. So I'll stop there.
Well, all right, I'm going to ask anybody else to ask a very tight question. Let's just answer the first question on rogue states.
I think you're right to point out that part of what's been missing is the conversation about the implications on ethics, but even malicious use and also the global competition. Without a doubt, there's now a bit of an arms race, quite frankly, between the United States and China when it comes to artificial intelligence. And it shouldn't be lost on us the fact that to the extent that these algorithms benefit from compute capacity and massive amounts of data, the Chinese will have lots of it, partly because their user base is just so large. And so it's quite possible they'll make fast progress simply because they've got lots of data available. So I think that question has been missing, and we probably don't have enough time to tackle it. But there's clearly an arms race here that's begun, and much of the efforts in China are very much government-led, by the way. The huge investments and commitments that they're making are very much being done by the government.
All right. I don't know where the microphone is, but can we take, right, there's a microphone coming to you. You can keep your hand up, and we'll squeeze another one in after this as well.
Hi. First, thank you very much for the panel. I have a relatively short question. Susan touched on this. We think of AI based on algorithms and data as being unbiased. But in fact, there is an enormous amount of bias, both gender and minority bias, baked in based on the data and the algorithms. And I'm just wondering how you think that might be addressed for the future of work.
I'll start and then. One of the things that I stood up at the Berkman Center at Harvard and MIT Media Lab was a data and ethics and governance thing for AI. And one of the major efforts that's going on there is to try to figure out what are the ways that we can kind of cross-check the data sets, and then because one of the things these learning networks do is that they're very hard to actually inspect how they operate, and how do you then do that in order to do this? This is a central problem that's really important because you do not want to bake in really terrible discriminatory practices just because you don't know, because the data set causes that as the learning outcome. So it's a super important problem, and I think right now it starts with funding people who are trying to figure out the concepts, the technologies, and the ideas in order to do that.
So I'd say that it's actually a really fun academic research issue as well, because it's basically a different optimization problem to optimize an algorithm under constraints of various sorts for fairness. But actually, I think you read about what you mentioned a lot in the press, but actually in practice, as AI and machine learning is getting implemented, it tends to have more of a debiasing effect than a pro-biasing effect. Because if you think about the kinds of decisions that we make, if I have to look at you for 3 seconds and decide about your resume, I might say, oh, you went to this college. Oh, this kid I hated from high school went to that college. It must be full of dumb people. Or, here I went to this college, so it must be full of brilliant people. So you're making these snap decisions based on stereotypes. You say, hey, I'm a 47-year-old mother of 3. What could I know about programming or machine learning, right? But then if you look at my resume in more detail, you might see that I know quite a bit. And so what these machine learning algorithms can do is they can take in all the information, and once you condition on everything about someone, those broad stereotypes can sometimes matter less. And so for things like bail decisions, screening resumes, and so on, they have both the potential and, even without trying too hard in practice, the ability to actually overcome human biases rather than just reinforce them.
Yeah, all right, and I'm clock watching here, but we're going to take one more and then we're going to let you go for coffee. I don't know where the microphone is. No, or are we, Mark, do we have time for one more?
Yeah, sure, right over
can't
here.
see
Sean,
where
right
we're
next to you.
Well, let's take one here and then we'll break. Yeah.
Joel Dietz, I'm a professional investor in AI and blockchain, and one of the things I've observed in the blockchain space that I think is also relevant to AI is the difficulty in regulators to keep pace with the evolving state of the field. And in some of the projects I've been involved in, like Ethereum, where I ran the Ethereum Silicon Valley office, they made a decision not to base the vast majority of their development resources inside the United States, partially for these concerns. And I know that other people, for example, I hosted something from Sam Altman from Y Combinator recently, and he stated that he believes that AGI is just around the corner. So these other sort of developments in the artificial intelligence space, how can the regulators or new institutions that provide the appropriate constraints but also allow for innovation evolve at something close to the pace of the actual technology itself without reducing the competitiveness, particularly within the US market?
So I just comment, like in financial institutions, you might want to use AI for something like anti-money laundering. But the regulators had a human framework where, okay, if you followed the checklist and something went wrong, you were fine. Replace that with an algorithm where I say, I know and I can demonstrate for you I make a mistake this percentage of the time. Well, knowing that you make mistakes is sort of not acceptable in anti-money laundering. And so you need a different regulatory framework to, obviously, the machines are going to do a better job than the human process, but you have to change your regulatory framework to acknowledge that you as a company may be making conscious decisions to take risks, and they will make mistakes, and they've decided to make those trade-offs, but they have to codify them in code rather than leave them ambiguous. And so that's something we need to learn to regulate. And then I'm also on the board of Ripple, which is a blockchain startup, and we have the same types of problems in blockchain that regulators may not advance quickly enough to help people innovate, and then you see people, you see these crypto exchanges that some of them are purely virtual, so you're putting your assets in a business where you don't even know who owns it or what country they're in. But partly because the entrepreneurs are fleeing regulatory uncertainty, or maybe they can't get a bank account because of regulatory constraints. And so generally, I think we need to be better as a society at getting experts in early and making sure that we can't stop the technology. So we want to make sure it develops. But if people are doing it in the US in a friendly regulatory environment, they will be more likely to protect their consumers than if they're, ran off to someplace and you can never track them down or put any pressure on them.
Good. All right. I think
We're good.
that.
Okay, great. Well, so please join me in thanking our panelists.